Hello, Bernie Wall here, and I want to look at some tips today on IELTS Academic Task 1. For those of you that haven't seen any of my videos, I'm an IELTS trainer and I specialise in helping students to achieve Band 7 and 8 in their IELTS exam. And one of the areas that causes the most problems, I think, for students at that level is the writing. So I want to look just at task 1 today and the academic task 1 and give you 3 secrets or 3 things that you must think about and that you must be very careful about when writing task 1. So I have, as ever, prepared a short presentation, which we'll take a look at now and look at how you can improve your academic task 1 writing. Okay, I've called it 3 secrets, but it's just really 3 things to bear in mind. So if we think about task 1 and what you need to do to achieve a band 7 or above at task 1, it's the following. So you must address whatever you're given, which could be data, it may be a diagram, a map, or a process. It must be clear and concise. I usually say to my students, if you're thinking about task 1, imagine that you're writing this description for somebody that just doesn't have time to look through all the data themselves. And so they want you to give a summary of what is going on and the main points. And if you think about the examiner in those terms, then I think it gives you an idea of how to write it so that the examiner can look through and say, okay, yes, I see, this is basically what's going on in this data. It needs to contain, obviously, very good vocabulary, which is appropriate to the task, and also very varied. The same is true of structure. So this is no different from task 2. You need a wide range of structures and many different ways of saying the same thing. You have to have complex sentences because they're in the band descriptors. And if you don't have complex sentences, you can't achieve a band 7. And the length is important. If it's less, you'll be penalised. And if it's too long, then to my mind, you're wasting time that should be spent really on your planning or your checking. So try and keep it within 150 to 180 words. And then that will fit quite well with the time too. So the first thing I think is to know your number vocabulary. Most of the task 1s that come up are data related, so bar charts, pie charts, line graphs. There are also dates in the maps, so you need to know how to handle dates as well. And sometimes in the process you may need to mention numbers, and there are also things like grouping things together, which are true of all the different types of task 1. It must be logical, so it's got to make sense to the examiner when they read it. So try and go from A to B to C. Keep close to your word count for the reasons I mentioned before. You don't want to waste time and you don't want to eat into your task 2 time. Right, so let's start with the number vocabulary. So can you describe all the different types of data? Remember, some of them have movement and some of them don't. So you can't always use the same language for all types of data. So in a bar chart, it would be very difficult to see fluctuation, for example. But in a line graph, fluctuation is very clear. So the word fluctuation may not be a good word to use if you're describing a pie chart or a bar chart. A chart that is static needs slightly different type of vocabulary. So consider this as well as what's actually happening and the numbers. And the other thing that you need to be able to do is to find lots of different ways of saying exactly the same thing. So let's have a look at a very simple example. So this is a very simple chart, a very simple line graph, which represents 6 months worth of sales. and we have thousands of units that were sold along this axis here. And we can see that there's a fairly steady progression over the first 3 months. Then there's a bit of a sharp rise here up to May, and then things increase again, albeit at a rather flatter level, up to June. And I want to look just at these two numbers here and show you 4 different ways of representing this increase between May and June. Okay, so the first thing is we know there was an increase, we know it was 10,000 units difference. So we can make a simple sentence using a preposition. Sales increased in June by 10,000 units. Now you might want to say this exact same sentence about another period on the chart, so a different 2 months, but you won't want to use exactly the same sentence. So here's another way, by using a period of time. So we've got the same verb here. You might want to change that if you did the same sentence. But sales increased from 45,000 units in May to 55,000 units in June. So here from to. Now, here's a third way. So now we've ditched increased and used a different verb, experienced, because we've changed this increase to a noun and made it a rise. And we are now doing a matching like with like. So we've got May and June together, and we've got the two numbers together. And when we do this, we can use respectively. And I'm sure many of you use respectively all the time in your task 1. And it is a good word to use, but do not use it more than once, because the second usage will automatically weaken your first usage. And they have to be matching like this, May to 45, June to 55. So organize the stuff properly. So sales experienced a rise from May to June with 45,000 and 55,000 units sold respectively. And that's now very clear. And finally, here is another way, by just putting the numbers in brackets as an illustration. So what's important here is that we're talking about the rise in sales in the summer. So summer sales rose, so we've got rise now instead of increased. Gradually, we've added an adverb to make it a little bit more illustrative. So we know that it's a gradual rise, not a fast rise, through May and June. And in order to give a little bit more information on exactly what is happening, we've put the numbers in brackets. So the numbers are here as an illustration. They are not part of the sentence. And if your numbers are part of the sentence, you cannot use the brackets. But it's a good way of adding in the numbers to a sentence without embedding them in the sentence itself. Okay, so let's think about how to organize things logically. So don't jump about, try and be systematic. Often when you look at the data, there is more than one way to express it. So where there are 2 ways to write about the data, choose the way that seems most logical to you, because whatever impresses you as being logical will be the best way for you to deal with it. But sometimes there are 2 ways of doing it. Go step by step so that it's clear. And where you've got a lot of data, particularly with more than one type of data, you might have a chart and a table, then try to be selective. You won't have time to put everything in. And use groups. So can you group things together, or can you have an average, or can you have a range for some of the items? So here's an example. It's from Academic Writing, I think by Sam McCarter, and it shows a bar chart and a pie chart. Now we can see it's about estimated sales, so it's going to be about the future. And there are 2 companies shown, Meteor Products and Mark Jones. The pie chart has the same, Meteor Products and Mark Jones, and it shows projected market share for this period. So the two things are not identical, therefore it's probably more logical to have a separate sentence for your pie chart. And it's only going to be a very short paragraph, maybe one sentence, maximum two sentences. And then if we look at the data here on the bar chart, we can either do the two companies separately, so one paragraph on Meteor and the second paragraph on Mark Jones, or you might want to split it in the middle somewhere, maybe go from January to July and then from August to December. Both are valid approaches. Personally, I think it makes more logical sense to do it by company because your pie chart is done by company. So if we look at it this way, then the structure of our task is going to be, okay, two separate paragraphs for each chart. So one for the bar chart, one for the, deal with them separately, sorry, is what I mean. And deal with the two companies separately. So the structure is going to look something like this. An introductory sentence saying what you can see, an overall, and here we can see that both companies' sales are going to rise over the period or expected to rise. So that could be our overall, that they both will experience rises in their sales. And then one paragraph explaining what happens with Meteor, second paragraph the same about Mark Jones, and then finally a sentence or two about the pie chart. And that should bring you around 150 to 180 words, and it will be very logical and you can make the comparisons quite clearly. Okay, and then the final secret or the final thing you ought to do is to keep close to the word count. You only have 20 minutes. Do not be using your task 2 time. That's not a good idea. So keep it tight. It's worth less than task 2. So that's another reason for not going over time. And by not going over time, it means that you need to stick to that word count. If you stick to the word count, you have to be selective because you don't have that many sentences to use. So it makes you choose the important features. It forces you to group things, to use averages, etc., which is all good. And that in turn will help you with the clarity and to help it be more concise so that it's not only going to be clearer, but it's also going to be more logical. So you don't need to be very elaborate and expansive like you do in task 2 by giving lots of evidence. Here you just need to be quite clear and concise and short. And here's an example of a table. And you can see there are lots and lots of numbers here. And I think if you first look at this, it can look to be quite scary because how do you deal with all those numbers? But if you look here, and I would say the percentages are the easiest thing to analyze first, we can see that the lowest number is 7.4 and the highest is 61.10. So that's quite a range. But if we look down, we can see 7 here, then we've got 8.10, 7.7, 8.7. So it looks as though we can pick out those 4 countries and group them around 8%. And just to check, if you look across at the other numbers to make sure that they are similar, so that you are comparing like with like, and that looks like a possibility. So then if we go to the next level, so we've got 10%, and then we've got 15.5%, and then we've got 10.3%. So it looks like those 3, again, could be grouped together. And again, check the numbers in the other 2 columns just to make sure. So that's 2 groups. Now go to the next level, we've got 34, we've got 25, and we've got 61. Okay, there's a big difference there, but not between 34 and 25. So that may be a possibility. And again, you'd need to check through the numbers to see whether they could be grouped. And then finally, we come to this big number here, 61.10%, which is very different from anything else on the table. So therefore, that looks like an outlier. And if we look across, we can see that the numbers here are also quite different from the others, except in this regard, because these two numbers are identical, yet look at the two numbers on monthly income and the two numbers in the percentages. So that might be a point that you have to make, a comparison that you need to make. So by grouping them, we can now create fewer sentences to look at the numbers, and we can have the numbers expressed in ranges or in averages or in groups. So here are the 4 countries around 8%, then 3 countries around between 10 and 15%. So here's an average, here's a range. These two are similar, so there are just 2 countries there, so you could make some comparisons there. And finally, Eritrea is completely different from the others, so you need to make special case about Eritrea and deal with that separately. But there is a contrast on the expenditure on petrol between Eritrea and Sweden that you may want to make, either in your overall or in one of your paragraphs. So by grouping, we now have fewer sentences, but we can have a lot more focus and clarity around the numbers and the information within those groups. Okay. So I hope that that helped to clarify a little bit on task 1. If you go over to my website, IELTSlearningtips.com, you'll find a longer article on this with a little bit more information. And there are also some free resources there that you can get hold of to help you with your IELTS preparation. So please encourage your friends to watch these videos too. And I hope that I'll see you on the next video. Thank you. Bye-bye.